In this series of 4 programmes, we look at the changing face of Britain's railways in the 40 years following World War II. We take you on a journey from nationalisation in 1948 to the dawn of the diesels and the decline of steam, and into the era of the advanced passenger train in the early 1980s.
During the Second World War, the railways did a tremendous job hauling passengers and freight trains around the country and providing material for the military forces overseas. But they did that with really rather little money being spent on maintenance of the track, the carriages and the locomotive. So when victory came in 1945, the railways were very, very run down. The locomotives were often in a poor state of repair. Wagons were often not really in a fit state to be used. Passenger coaches were tatty and so on. The track was very, very rough. So a lot of repairs had to be done. There was money to carry out the repairs, but there wasn't really the materials to do so. And so it took a long time for Britain's railways to get back to anything like the good state of repair that they'd been in before the Second World War.
Let's take a ride on Britain's latest train, the Pullman that gives you a window on the world, the Devon Belle. These folks are not only travelling through some of Britain's loveliest countryside, through rolling farmlands to the West Country, but they can see it all in comfort. This is travel as it should be.
Refreshment cars are back, with a difference. The Southern Railway has converted them into travelling snack bars, and by bars I really mean bars. The snacks are available too, of course, and altogether the journey to Hastings, on which the first of these modern services is running, is going to be a jollier and more sociable business. Incidentally, there's going to be no discrimination between classes of ticket holders, so third and first class travellers needn't look suspiciously or even defiantly at one another over this new improvement for passengers. Good old Southern.
In the interwar period, the big 4 railway companies had started to get themselves into financial difficulties, largely because road competition had been building. Buses were taking passengers away from the trains, and lorries were taking an increasing proportion of the nation's goods. Those trends were halted, indeed reversed, during the Second World War, and the railways provided the backbone of the wartime transport. But after the war, despite the continuation of petrol rationing, road competition started to bite again, and the financial difficulties which the Big Four had found themselves in the 1930s reappeared. So in the short period between the end of the Second World War and nationalisation of the railways in 1948, the company's finances continued to deteriorate, and it was clear that there were going to be real problems in re-equipping the railways in the post-war period. The railways were nationalised in 1948, but up until that point there had been 4 big railway companies that had provided trains across the whole of the United Kingdom. The 4 companies were the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, which was the biggest one, and had run trains from London right up into Scotland and into North Wales. London North Eastern Railway ran up and down the east side of the country. The Great Western Railway had been around since the 1830s, served the West Country and the industrial heartlands of South Wales and the West Midlands. The Southern Railway was really a commuter railway around London and the home counties, but it had lines going right down into the West Country, so it was a holiday route as well.
Weekends are the holidays that happen every week, and every Saturday the year through you'll see them, the families and the young folks, leaving the cares of the week, office and factory, yes, and housework too, behind them. The some folks, it's the 11:45 to the country or the seaside. But it doesn't really matter where. Anywhere will do, anywhere that's far away. For weekending is Britain's institution, the tradition shared by rich, poor and in between of finding freedom. Once a week, till Monday comes round again.
Now let's forget about work. Take a holiday. Jump aboard a train on a two-way ticket to paradise in a railway siding. This is life in a camping coach. It's an idea worth trying when your favorite seaside resort's full up. You hire a coach, take a return for the family to a quiet siding in the country, and make yourself at home on wheels. A coach makes a grand holiday villa. Specially fitted up for domestic occupation, it's roomy and bright inside, with everything laid on for mother's comfort. With the whole coach to themselves, the family were shunted into a siding by the engine which brought them from their own hometown. There's a fitted kitchen and just up the line, a shopping centre. For hundreds of families, the camping coach is just the ticket for a first-class holiday.
The railways were nationalised by the Labour government under the 1947 Transport Act, which came into effect in 1948. And the government's preferred vehicle for managing the railways was something called the British Transport Commission, an entirely new body. And as its name suggests, the British Transport Commission, or the BTC, was not responsible just for the railways, because the Transport Act had nationalised a whole range of other modes of transport, including many bus companies, road haulage firms, or long-distance road haulage firms, inland waterways, some canals and some navigations, rivers, and also, this is perhaps quite surprising, things like hotels, because the interwar railway companies have been quite large operators of hotels. So hotels became part of the British Transport Commission's responsibilities, largely because it took over the railways. So the railways were just one part of the Labour government's very ambitious plans to nationalise and regulate transport on the nation's behalf, as it was put at the time. When the decision had been taken to nationalise the railways under the British Transport Commission, then there was a problem of how it was actually going to work out in practice. And the solution, at least for the next few years, was to run them by another new organisation called the Railway Executive, which, as its name suggests, was a management body, had responsibility for all Big Four companies, which had been merged into what now became known as British Railways. The new organisation was almost, but not quite, the Big Four under a different label. A lot of the old company traditions did continue, a lot of the old company structures continued, but the railways were now geographically divided into a number of regions. The southern region, more or less like the old Southern Railway, the western region, which was more or less the old Great Western Railway. But the London Midland and Scottish Railway and the London North Eastern Railways were split up, and their Scottish operations were merged into a new Scottish regions. The rest of the London Midland and Scottish Railway became the London Midland region, and the London North Eastern Railway, now shorn of its Scottish arm, was further divided into two regions: the Eastern region, from London up to the north of England, and then the northeastern region with its headquarters in York, dealing with more or less the territory that the old Northeastern Railway from before 1923 had operated within. So there was a regional structure now, coordinated, if that's the right word, by the Railway Executive, which had an overview for the whole of the new British Railways operation. British Transport Commission was a very, very ambitious piece of politics. The idea was to take all the major components of the transport system in Britain and to meld them together, to merge them into an integrated transport system in which each mode of transport did what it could do best, and that was the rhetoric at the time. So railways would continue to be the backbone of the transport system, but road services, buses and road haulage would also provide services where the railways couldn't provide them satisfactorily or at a cheap enough cost. That, I think, was a very good idea, but it was very, very difficult to turn it into a practical, workable reality. And unfortunately, the British Transport Commission did become a very bureaucratic organisation which struggled largely unsuccessfully to merge these various modes of transport into one system. The railways were by far and away the largest single responsibility that the BTC had. And the day-to-day management of the railways was left to the railway executive, which was nominally under the control of the British Transport Commission, but in fact, until it was abolished in 1953, the railway executive largely went its own way. It consisted of mostly of managers from the old companies, who, generally speaking, did not have a very high regard for the civil servants and other individuals who made up the British Transport Commission. And I think one consequence of this old railway school tie approach of the railway executive was that it was rather unimaginative when it came to facing the new competitive conditions of the 1950s. Road transport was really beginning to make a strong comeback despite problems of petrol rationing and so on in the late 1940s. And the railways needed to respond if they were to retain their role as the backbone of the nation's transport. And until the middle 1950s, the railways were hampered by a lack of materials to renew the infrastructure, to repair the wagons and the coaches. Some progress was made, but not enough really to compete with the increased threat of road competition. And I think it's true as well that the managers of the railway executive were rather unimaginative and probably could have done more despite the limited resources they had to redefine what it was that the railway was about, to focus more on on identifying what the railway could do well and what it really ought to leave to road competition.
An indication of the shape of things to come on Britain's railways was provided by the LMS just 2 months before nationalisation, with the introduction of their new prototype diesel-electric locomotive.
This is the bedroom at Derby of Britain's first diesel-electric passenger engine. And this is number 10,000 itself. For information, please, this week, Pathé Pictorial takes you on a trip with the engine that never runs late. A favourite with engine spotters, as well as with passengers on the Derby-London line, number 10,000 is the only engine of its type in service. It develops 1,600 horsepower and a top speed of 93 miles an hour. On this run, it's pulling a train of 400 tons. Smokeless and grime-free, the driver's cabin's as trim as a parlour. The driver sits at a dashboard and employs a master key attached to a control tower. Braking is done by foot. Quick acceleration is the secret of its phenomenal performance. number 10,000 and a sister engine under construction prove we're still second to none in railway engineering.
But it was to be another 10 years until the introduction of another new mainline diesel class onto British railways. For now, it was the steam engine that reigned supreme. Upon nationalisation, the British Transport Commission had inherited over 20,000 steam locomotives. The railway executive saw no reason why steam should not continue to be the main source of motive power. In 1948, they began planning for steam's long-term future by launching a major programme of locomotive exchange trials between the various regions.
British railway engines, being produced in ever-increasing numbers for home and abroad, undergo new trials that will make them the fastest locos in the world. Already holding the world record of 126 miles an hour, the aim is now for greater speed still. At the newly completed Rugby testing station, the latest type of roller bench is used as a stationary test bed. Capable of recording speeds of up to 130 miles an hour, the plant's main function is to improve existing methods for fuel saving. In the instrument room, a complicated panel of dials records all speed and lubrication data. With equipment costing more than £200,000, Rugby's loco testing station is one of the scientific marvels of the age.
I do sincerely believe that the steam engine is the nearest thing to a living creature that anyone's ever created. I'm not comparing it to terribly clever small computers that do or don't simulate your pet cat, but the steam locomotive is an infinitely subtle and flexible thing that responds to its treatment, its maintenance regime, and a lot of people got very, very fond of them. I've never really heard of anyone being that fond of a computer. People seem to get genuinely fond of diesels, but in amongst the fond is impressed, which isn't always the same thing. I think the affection for the steam locomotive seems to be something actually separate from its time in history, its relationship to its historical context, or even the experiences of the people who have affection for it. You know, small children today feel immense affection for a motive power that they never knew in their normal world. Old people who had a pretty hard-working life are still immensely fond of the things.
I started on the 28th of January 1946 at 15, and I started as an engine cleaner, which you did. You could do any length of time engine cleaning. Some men done 2 or 3 years, some did a year, some men could do 6 months. It all depended the size of the depot you were at. I started and I got made a cleaner, and I did 1.5 years. And then on August the 19th, 1947, I got made a fireman at 16 years of age. When you went on as got made a fireman, you were put on shunting pilots in yards, so you were with old drivers who were men maybe on light duty, so they would now start to teach you the basics of controlling your fire and water. They didn't want smoke flowing around the yard, they didn't want the engine blowing its head off all day at the safety valves, so they taught you the basics of keeping. And as a cleaner, you would assist old hand firemen at times getting their engines ready if you had the time to do it, and watch them, see how they worked. And it helped you because you thought, well, I know, see what he's been doing on that big engine, so it was all a learning curve. As my father told me when I started, he was a driver. He'd done all his time. He started at Old Oak Common in 1919 as a young fireman. And he was a driver at Southall, and he said to me, well, now you've got the job, he said, I'll give you a few tips, he said. One, he said, you've got a job for life, which you had. You'll earn a regular income. He said, you're pensioned. He said, you're going to learn an art now, he said, that's no good to you anywhere else, which it wasn't. The only good it was that when you got a driver's job, you could teach young firemen the basics as you were taught. also, he said, you'll work all hours of the day and night that God made. He said, you'll be getting up at 2, 3 and 4 in the morning and coming to work. He said, you'll be going home at 2, 3 and 4 in the morning to go to bed. He said, on Saturday nights, he said, when all your mates are getting ready to go out for an evening, he said, you'll be getting ready to come to work. He said, so you've got to make your mind up what you want to do. But I stuck the job, and my brother came on the job as well. As a fireman, you progressed through the jobs, shunting pilots, trip working round from yard to yard with trains, little freight trains, till you progressed on to other jobs. I mean, I went through, we used to get spare work on auto cars and doing little passenger work jobs, and then into the goods work, which was a lot of double home work. I mean, I did a lot of double home work on Vackham goods. That's heavy freights, because mostly a lot of it was night work, because most of the Vackham freights always ran during the night hours, so you were on nights most of the time, like, you know. You as a fireman, once you've done, I would say, 7 to 8 years, would now start having your job at your fingertips. You could get on any engine and you knew how to fire it. I went with a bloke, it was a job, I was a young fireman, and I got booked out with this driver. His name was Wiggins, Ted Wiggins, and it was a 748 Acton to South Cardiff Vackham it was, Vackham Goods, Sea Headlight. And I was a young fireman, and because his mate was off, and I got with him, and by the time we'd left Acton, we're coming through Southwell, I'm having a struggle with this all, like, you know, and he come over and he said, what's happening, Ted? He said, I don't know, Edward, I said, there's something wrong with this. Hey, get over there, he said, let me have a look at this. And he got stuck in, and I'm busy, we're driving along on this freight, and I'm watching him, then all of a sudden he goes, there you are, he said, now, look at all that, he said, now, just keep it like that, he said, and you won't go wrong. He said, always keep that big middle fire, he said. You've got to keep that up, he said. All right, and we went with him, had a good trip. When you look at it, you used to come on, say, the early hours of the morning, you're going to get a castle ready, and you come round the engine, he's got about 40 pound of steam and about 1 inch of water showing in the boiler gauge here, nice bit of fire at the back end. And you've now got to get this engine ready for a mainline job. So you're going to make sure you do all your outside first, which is smoke box and sands and all that. Then you come in, level your fire down. Now you start building this fire, getting all the big lumps out of the tender and getting them in there, making a big fire. And then you're trimming your tender. And then you sweep up and clean up. You get all you might have to be running around looking for tools at sometimes you have to. Your mate's busy oiling round. Hour and 20 minutes. And you had to be coming out the shed to go off shed.
Waterloo Station, and a tribute to Sir Eustace Missenden, chairman of the Railway Executive and former general manager of the Southern Railway. Officials with distinguished war records formed a guard of honor when a new Battle of Britain class engine was named after the man who directed many historic railway operations from Dunkirk to D-Day. A short turn on the footplate of his namesake was fully enjoyed by a popular railway chief.
Former Preston Losthawk Hall engineman John Fletcher's love of steam still continues today on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, driving his favourite engines, the famous LMS Black 5s.
When you were young and you learned how to do all this, how did you learn?
Well, it was a gradual process. Whilst you were the fireman, you were picking up the job as you went along. I mean, it was a very long apprenticeship. I did 1,400 and odd firing turns in a 7-year apprenticeship before you were allowed to be taking your driving exam, if you will. And that was considered really, I mean, in my uncle's days, you could be firing until you were 50 years of age before you got to be a driver. 35-year apprenticeship. In the norm, it would be 10, 15 years before you would be allowed to go for driving. And all the time you were learning. If you got a decent driver, you would swap round, certainly, would let you drive. You would fire. And you were being tutored. that way. And you went to classes, MIC classes, mutual improvement classes, to learn a little bit more about it, the insight of it all. Approaching Levisham, we passed another train here, the one going to Pickering, and the engine on this train is another of my old engines, 45407, another Black 5. Never thought I'd see these, and wildest dreams never thought they'd still be running 40 years later.
No?
Got the light?
On the light.
Looking back, which is a long time now, I think that my interest in railways, well, I've always had an interest in railways ever since I can remember anything really. My mentor was an uncle of mine who was a driver on the railway, a steam engine driver, and when it was his day off, or once a fortnight possibly, he'd come and visit us, and he knew I was a train spotter. I used to go out quite a lot around the Preston area, taking engine numbers, which he did then, and I would ask him questions about the railway and about steam engines, and not technical ones, but the ones I couldn't really understand at the time. And I used to go around visiting the engine sheds, and I think really when I left school, anything I wanted to be was an engine driver, and so that's what I did. I left school when I was 15, and within days I had started work at an engine sheds near Preston, at Lostock Hall engine sheds near Preston, which was an old Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway engine shed. I started as an engine cleaner right at the bottom of the tree, and along with a lot of, I think a lot of the guys that were there wanted to be there. It wasn't a job that you went for just because it was a job. I would say 60% of the guys I worked with were there because they had an interest in railways, and in particular the steam locomotive. So it really, I couldn't wait. I used to go home, and then the only thing I would look forward to was going back the day after. Such was my interest and enthusiasm for it. And it's lasted right through until the present day. But looking back at those days, they were tough days, they were tough times, and it was hard physical graft. It was a dirty job, but you didn't bother really. I mean, you weren't doing something that you didn't want to do, and and eventually you did progress to become a past cleaner or a fireman when you actually went out on the locomotives. Although unofficially we used to ride out on them after our day's duty cleaning them. Some of the drivers and firemen would take you out, and a lot of the work we had there was mainly local passenger work, freight work. And then I hadn't been there very long when the depot at Preston, there was a bad fire there and burnt the roof off the engine sheds, and they closed that depot and sent all the men and the engines up to our depot. And a lot of their work was mainline passenger work, express work with big engines, and overnight it transformed us from being just a little backwater place to a mainline steam depot, which suited us down to the ground as young firemen. And I went all over the London Midland region firing big steam engines, little steam engines, shift work. A lot of the turns we had were early morning starts, and for instance, if I was working say 3:30 in the morning, 4 a.m. I used to bike it to work. That was 3 miles on my push bike, different weathers, and you would get there, and many a time the engines you were working on, there was more protection on your push bike than there was on the engines. Only had half a cab, a lot of them. The first duties, of course, would be to sign on and read the daily notices of any possible signal alterations, track repairs, etc., and link up with your driver, and out we would go. And Preparing the engine, well, my duties were attending to the fire, making sure raising steam pressure, boiler water level, cleaning all the cab down, making sure we had all the tools on board, taking on board water and coal, and the driver's duties would be to examine the locomotive and oil round all the working parts on it. Many times these engines we had 3-cylinder steam locomotives, which meant that the driver would have to go underneath and oil up all the working parts. And in many cases, you're talking about fellas in their 60s, and it was a heavy physical job to do that. So in many cases, the fireman would do that work for him, would oil up underneath. And then you would leave the depot. You gave you an hour to prepare the locomotive, and off you would go down to, depending on what you're working, passenger or freight work. And many times we would have jobs where it meant that we would be staying away from home for a couple of days on lodging turns, even then in the 60s, and spend quite a lot of time lodging at Carlisle, for instance, and lodged 2 or 3 places on the railway, and that meant you staying out overnight in accommodation that was next to the railway goods yards usually, and trying to get some sleep was out of the question. But it made a man of you, I think, really, and that was a lot of it. And you went from a boy to a man when you were working on these big steam locomotives. Because you've got to remember, the drivers were not physically capable, a lot of them, of firing that locomotive. They'd been in the late 50s and 60s. I mean, some were, but a lot of them, it was your job. And no steam, the engine won't go anywhere. And, you delayed the railway, your driver would get into trouble with delays and reports. But you worked together as a team. You've got to remember, you were confined to that footplate of a steam locomotive, which possibly, 6 foot by 6 foot space, 8 hours a day, more sometimes, 12 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week in, week out, month in, month out, with many a time with the same driver for perhaps 6 months, 12 months, and boy, if you didn't get on with each other, there was nowhere to hide. Fortunately, the drivers I fired for on a regular basis, I got on quite well with them, and they got on with me. A lot of it depended on your own attitude. If you were a bit bolshy and a little bit clever, I suppose, steam engine is a great leveller, and it'll find your faults, and if the driver wasn't too happy with you, he could make your life harder by driving the engine a little bit harder as well, which often happened. This is my old engine, as I say, I used to work on it years ago. Never thought we'd get on it now, 40 years later. In those days, we were running at much higher speed with these engines. Quite normal to run these at 75, 80 miles an hour. Here, lines are 25. Time ago, but we would use these extensively on mixed traffic locomotive, equally at home on freight trains, passenger trains, parcel trains, shunting, do anything these Black 5. Best steam engine they ever built. In the coaches, we're putting steam through the coaches, keep them warm for the passengers. Just readjusting the pressure, that's the gauge there. That's the brake gauge up there, the vacuum brake. When you open the regulator or throttle, etc., that's the blowing steam from the boiler into the cylinders. That is telling me how much of that steam pressure I am actually using. That is the steam chest pressure gauge. It's a driver's aid. See, with a steam engine, you cannot relax with them, really. You're on your toes all the time. Always something to do with them. Always something to adjust. Always something happening with them. With the diesel, you can sit there all day long. Open, close a lever or electric. And not these things. More or less demand constant attention. A bit like a woman.
This week's information story comes from Waterloo Station. At the peak hour, 7 trains leave or arrive here every 5 minutes. Behind their safe journey in or out of the station lies a complicated system centred in Waterloo's signal box. On a coloured panel are shown the track circuits within 2 1/4 miles. Every train is indicated, the exact position shown and its progress charted. 309 signal levers control all the rolling stock within the area. When a train nears, the lever is released and locked. The relay box goes down, the line is signalled clear and the train can pass through. As another train is due in, the signal levers are released and pass current to the relay box, which in turn operates the points mechanism. A daily check on the relay panel ensures that everything goes off without a hitch. This is the other side of the main indicator panel. Maintenance mechanics are on duty 24 hours a day to keep it in smooth working order. An all-electric box, Waterloo Signal Controls, number nearly 200. On the men in the box rests a heavy responsibility measured in human lives. Theirs is a backroom job, the vital link in daily guiding 1,200 trains to Waterloo's platforms.
One of the attractions of railway travel has long been the ability to have a meal or a drink on the move. Oliver Bulleid, who had been Chief Mechanical Engineer on the Southern Railway and then the Southern Region of British Railways, came up with another one of his typically quirky ideas in the late 1940s, which were the so-called tavern cars. Now, these were buffet cars which were designed on the inside to look like typical country pub, believe it or not, along with false timbering and this sort of thing. And they were painted on the outside as well in an extraordinary fashion to look like pubs, complete with pub names and what have you.
The local takes to wheels as Britain's nationalised railways open the first travelling taverns. With oak beams, settees and that oldie-worldy atmosphere, the tired businessman can in future pretend he'd already in the country pub.
The really clever thing, although it was an idea that backfired, was that there were no windows or no big windows in these tavern cars. There were just little windows high up on the side of the carriages. So you couldn't stand at the bar or stand in the carriage and look out at the scenery. And the thinking was this: if people can't look out, then they're not going to hang around, they're not going to congregate around the bar. They'll get what it is they want, a pint of bitter and a packet of crisps, and move away. So you'll get the throughput, the bar area won't get congested, people will just buy what they want, clear out, and you'll make more money that way. Problem was that people had been used to standing at the bar and or sitting down and looking out the window, and they didn't like it. perhaps predictably. And there were very, very high volumes of complaints from passengers about not being able to see out. And quite quickly, British Railways realised that although it might have been a good idea, it wasn't an idea that was working. And the tavern cars were withdrawn and rebuilt as conventional buffet cars.
Very smart, but personally I'd sooner look out of the window than watch some people drinking soup.
One of the problems that the Southern Railway and then the Southern region has always faced has been that of capacity when it comes to commuting flows. Southern Railway had been very, very successful, particularly between in the 1930s, in persuading people to use its new electric trains to go in and out of London for work and for pleasure and so on. And that continued after the war. Problem was, how do you fit more and more people into trains which are limited in terms of their length? You can't just keep on adding more and more coaches because platforms, for example, are limited in their length and are very, very expensive to lengthen. So just after the Second World War, Oliver Bulleid came up with an interesting idea to create double-decker trains, something which is quite common nowadays on the continent, but has always been a problem in this country because we have a relatively restricted loading gauge. In other words, our bridges and our tunnels are really quite small by overseas standards, and there's not really enough space to get two proper decks in.
The bus train takes to the rails. At London's Charing Cross, Britain's first double-decker train is sent on its way by Mr. Morrison and given an approving once-over by its drivers of tomorrow. For its maiden journey, this all-British-built train has distinguished company, Transport Minister Alfred Barnes and the Lord President, himself a frequent traveller on this Dartford line.
So Bulleid's so-called double-decker trains weren't genuine double-deckers. There was a very clever arrangement in engineering terms whereby the passengers in the upper deck, their feet sort of dangled in the ceiling space above the passengers in the lower deck. So it was a sort of 1.5 decker, rather cramped inside, which didn't make them very popular with passengers. And they weren't very popular with the train operators either, because in order to get these all these passengers into the coach, there weren't that many doors. You couldn't have the traditional Southern Region or Southern Railway Southern Region design of a door to every compartment, which made for quick access and exit from the train. You couldn't do that on the double-deckers. So the trains used to hang around for quite a long time at the stations while everybody got themselves out of these funny compartments and down the stairs at the end and out onto the platform. So they weren't popular with the passengers, they weren't that popular with the operators, and only the original 2 prototypes were ever built. Although they did continue into, they continued in service through the 1950s and into the 1960s before they were finally scrapped.
Swindon, celebrating the Jubilee of the Borough, gave a royal welcome to Princess Elizabeth. A visit to the railway works was one item on an extensive programme, and here Her Royal Highness watched the casting of her own name and evidently found it rather fascinating. She christened a new engine, and boarding the footplate of another, she herself drove it from the sheds to the platform. For their train to be drawn by the world speed record-breaking Mallard, number 60022, was an extra thrill for schoolboy loco spotters. Nearly 1,000 of them went aboard at King's Cross for the trip to Doncaster to have a look at the construction and repair sheds there. Meanwhile, notebooks and pencils went into action during the journey. Spotting engines is one thing, and a very popular pastime it is. But at Doncaster, these club members were able to get a real close-up in the Eastern Region works. They saw how locos are made, and they saw not only the wheels, but also what makes the wheels go round. To judge by our pictures of the boys' inspection, absolutely nothing was taken for granted.
In the late 1940s, it was clear that the railways needed to modernise their traction, their locomotives. And the big question was whether this was going to be done using the traditional technology of the steam locomotive, or whether there was going to be a shift to more modern forms of traction. At that time, the options were electric locomotives, diesel locomotives of some kind, and even gas turbine locomotives. And the senior engineers within the railway executive were actually quite keen on electrification. They saw that as the way forward. But the problem with electrification is it's very, very expensive. In terms of money, it also takes a lot of materials up, and neither money nor materials were in plentiful supply in the late 40s, early 1950s. So the decision was made to use steam traction. Steam locomotives are pretty cheap to build. They don't require lots of additional infrastructure like wires and masts and so on that you need if you electrify. So use less materials. The workshops were geared up to building steam locomotives. So in many ways it was a sensible decision to use steam traction under those very particular circumstances. Now, having decided to use steam locomotives, you then have to decide whether to continue building more of the old company designs or whether you build afresh. And here it becomes more controversial, because the decision was to build, well, a bit of both actually. The railway workshops continued to turn out some of the more modern of the big four railway companies' designs, but British Railways also started designing 12 new designs of steam locomotives, the so-called standards.
Trials completed and passed for the Iron Road, British Railways Loco number 70,000 is ready for service. It's the first of the new standard locomotives, so the Minister of Transport, Mr. Alfred Barnes, gives it a name and his blessing. Suitable for express passenger or fast goods trains, the new standards include the best ideas from the pre-nationalisation types. It's the first of 25 now under construction at Crewe. But when they're all standard, isn't life going to be dull for those who love the old giants of the Iron Road?
These locomotives would eventually replace the many dozens, if not hundreds, of old designs inherited from the big four companies, some of them going back to the 19th century. All these would be replaced by a much smaller number of these standard steam locomotives, which, precisely because they were standard, they shared lots of components between classes and so on, would be cheaper to build, cheaper to operate, simple to maintain, and appropriate to the working conditions, the labour markets and so on of the 1950s. The person responsible for the British Railways standard range was Robert Riddles, who was the member of the railway executive responsible for mechanical engineering. And Riddles was a steam man through and through, although he did, in fairness to him, see the potential for electrification. His preferred option was to electrify as much of the railway as was possible, but it wasn't really possible to electrify very much of it. So it was Riddles who was the driving force behind the decision to build the standard steam locomotives. He was a designer. He had designed steam locomotives in the past, but by this point in his career, he was a very senior manager. And although he did have a hand in some of the important design decisions, Riddles was not the man who carried out the detailed design of the locomotives. He left that to his trusted lieutenants from the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, two engineers called Cox and Bond. Riddles had been responsible during the Second World War for designing several locomotives for the Ministry of Supply, which was the government body responsible for transport. One of these locomotives was a heavy freight locomotive, the so-called Austerity 210. That had 10 driving wheels and a couple of carrying wheels on the pony truck at the front. And it was that wheel arrangement which was to be seen in the heavy freight locomotive, the 9F, that Riddles and his team developed for British Railways in the early 1950s. But there wasn't really a lot more of the wartime austerity in the 9F, because the austerity locomotives had been built in order to be built very quickly, to have a relatively short life, to be thrown away after a few years. The 9Fs, on the other hand, were designed to last for 20 years or so, and were manufactured in a rather more robust way, really as railway locomotives had always been built in this country. So there was something of the austerity in the 9F in terms of the basic outline of the design, but in terms of the detail, it was a very different locomotive.
Steam engines have been built at Crewe for 115 years, but this is the last they'll ever make. Nowadays, steam's giving way to diesel-electric power. Over 7,300 engines have been built at Crewe, and that's a lot of locomotives. But times are changing, and one day, even this newborn monster will be just a number in a schoolboy's scrapbook, just a stack of steel on the scrap heap.
There's no doubt that the standards were meant to be just that, standard, a better exchangeability of parts, better accessibility, easier to work, easier to dispose, and so on. It's interesting that we now have an NRM with very few standards in. We've got Evening Star because it's Evening Star, not because it's a 9F, I would suggest. And that was probably a mistake. We haven't got the standards that we should, because when people set up places like the early preservation venues, they were looking back to the pre-grouping engines, never mind the nationalised product. And actually, people like Rolt or Betjeman or anyone else were very quick to sort of say, oh, designed by a committee, you know, rather than saying actually Riddles did this. And to not take it seriously as a glorious machine. So history hasn't been terribly kind to the standards, and I would love to have seen them work their lives out. To have seen, you know, within the Thatcher era, worn-out 9Fs coming through Newcastle would have been fantastic alternative history. And it still seems to me silly that you look at the lifespan of some of these engines, you know, barely run in and never given a real chance to perform or make any sense. You know, today we're told sustainability. You know, the good car, if there is such a thing as a good car in this day and age, is one that actually lasts. And there they are building things that were meant to last 30, 40 years, going to the scrapyard for a theory, and never really perhaps proving what they were like. It's very interesting now that a lot of steam railways are increasingly relying on the standards, whether in fact they're standardised designs like the austerities, or in fact the standard tanks or whatever, and they are so much easier to keep going today, partly through metallurgy, partly through age, partly through standardised design, than a pre-grouping loco that same steam railway may have had as its figurehead in, what, the late 60s, early 70s.
Hopefully this would be able to operate on all the regions, these locomotives. It was going to last right through to the end of steam. It was supposedly going to last right through the mid-1970s. And they quickly proved popular with the footplate crews. They were much easier to prepare in the morning, the preparation of them, the disposal of them was easier. They were fitted with much more modern equipment. The disposal of them was easier because they fitted modern rocking grates with them where you could just rock the fire out of them. self-cleaning smoke boxes, etc. I mean, for instance, this machine behind us was one of the classes of standards. It's very popular here. They are easier to drive and fire than the majority of steam engines we have here, which is a good point for a lot of the guys who are just learning the job. A general overall opinion of them is they're well liked, and I worked on them a lot in my days on the railway. The Britannia class in particular I was fond of. We did a lot of work on Britannia classes. Yes, there was, I would say, approved by most footplate guys. It was slightly better riding, a lot of them. All the controls that I need as a driver at my side, controls for the fireman or at the fireman's side. Yeah, I think all round the standard class were a success, but of course they never saw the time through. They were withdrawn halfway through the working lives, and much money was put into the modernisation plan of 1955 for diesels, etc., where the railways were going to invest a huge amount in diesel locomotives, but a lot of them were not proven designs. And in many cases, the old steam engine was a better spec. They were a popular engine, and we are fortunate here in having two of the standard class. We did have three, and ideally for the type of operation we have here, they are for sort of like, we might say, branch line work. They're a versatile locomotive. Two of them, the standard 4 tender engine and the standard 4 tank, are our most popular engines. They are, as I've said, they're easy to operate, and from a trainee point of view, if we have the guys coming along who want, you know, they've no railway experience, there's no finer locomotive than these to learn your trade on. To compare this, we have this as a standard 4 tender loco. We have the tank version of it. Ideal, absolutely ideal for this railway. Backwards and forwards running. We have a turntable, but we don't use it. But you've seen the operation when we run tender first. It's a bit drafty and it can be a bit wet. With the tank engine, it doesn't matter which way around you use it. They're a modern design. They're superior to the previous tank engines, one of the big 4 company engines. There were some good machines amongst them, but the idea was they put all the best parts of the previous classes together in one standard design, and hopefully that would have improved on them all. And we call the standard tank the office. It's like a day out at the office, it really is. It's so easy to operate. You've still got demands the same amount of attention as the other locomotives, but everything you require is there for you. The free steaming locomotives, which is another thing with inexperienced firemen, can usually get a bit of steam out of them with a little bit of tuition, and it gives them a bit of confidence to move on to the bigger, slightly more, not say complicated, but engines that require a little bit more experience. That's a good grounding for them to operate on the standard classes.
It was very striking that when they came out of the workshops, most of the BR standards looked pretty similar to locomotives that had been built in the 1940s by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. And that wasn't really a surprise because the three engineers who were primarily responsible for the standard range, Riddles, Cox and Bond, were all LMS men. And they believed, rightly or wrongly, that the LMS in the 1940s had stolen a march on the other three railway companies when it came to steam locomotive design. And it is true that the LMS locomotives had been designed with simplicity, ease and maintenance very much to the fore. And in the post-war conditions of austerity and labour shortages and increasingly poor coal, they were pretty good locomotives for those conditions. Not all the standards looked like LMS locomotives though. The heavy freight locomotive, the 9F, was a completely new design which had taken some of its inspiration from LMS freight locomotives, but was very much a development of the thinking of that and other companies when it came to heavy freight haulage. The British Transport Commission was set up in 1948 with overall responsibility for the railways. But in practice, for the first 5 years of its existence, the BTC delegated that responsibility to the Railway Executive. Now, the Railway Executive was abolished in 1953, partly because there had been a lot of bad blood between the Executive and the BTC, but mostly because a new government, a Conservative government, had been elected, replacing the Labour government which had been responsible for the nationalisation of transport. And the Tories took one look at the working relationship between the BTC and the Railway Executive and decided that something had to be done to give a firmer sense of control over the railways, got rid of the Railway Executive and gave the British Transport Commission responsibility not only for a strategic overview of how the railway is to be run, but also the day-to-day management of the job. One can understand the government's desire to get rid of the Railway Executive, but giving the job of running the railways on a day-to-day basis to the British Transport Commission was probably not a very wise decision, because partly to do with the sort of people who sat on the BTC, partly because the BTC had other responsibilities as well. It still had responsibility for other parts of the nationalised transport system.
Passengers for York, long brought safely in by the men who handled the 867 levers controlling the lines into the city, now finish their journey in charge of the largest route relay interlocking scheme in the world. Completed at a cost of more than $500,000, the new all-electric finger and thumb operated system does the work of 8 of the old-style boxes. The turn of a switch works the signals and sets the route. Diagrams using 5,000 lights show the position of all trains on 33 miles of track. The panel consists of 827 routes by means of 74 sets of signals and 157 sets of points. Above the diagram is the traffic register, which shows the position at the 16 platforms and the sidings of York Station. With the new system, North Eastern Region achieves economy and safety and steps up speed in transit.
Now, in the early 1950s, it became clear to the Railway Executive and the British Transport Commission that stopping passenger services, local passenger trains, were losing a lot of money. And if these services weren't to be withdrawn, then something had to be done to improve their economics. Now, the British Transport Commission had as one of its members a man called FAA Pope, who had been a senior manager on the London, Midland and Scottish Railways and then gone to work in Northern Ireland with the Ulster Transport Authority. And Pope had there experimented with lightweight diesel trains, diesel multiple units, and had come to the conclusion that they could do a lot for the economics of local passenger services. And it was he who sold this idea to the British Transport Commission, which encouraged the railway executive to think about introducing diesel multiple units. And the railway executive, for once, was fairly receptive to the ideas of the BTC, and in fairly short order came up with some workable plans to introduce these lightweight diesel trains, initially on branch line services, where passenger loadings were often very light by the 1950s.
All set for a trial run in Yorkshire from Bradford to Leeds is one of British Railway's new lightweight diesel trains. The introduction of these trains is part of a scheme to make rail travel in this country faster, cleaner, more pleasant and even, yes, they've thought about it at last, on time. Advantages over steam include the need for less depot servicing because they're so much cleaner and easier to run. Others are better viewing facilities, either end drive, more speed, particularly uphill, and greater acceleration pickup. One-man control saves staff too. In more ways than one, the new diesel car should be able to show the trains of yesterday a clean pair of wheels.
The trains were introduced in 1954, proved very popular, often did radically improve the finances of branch lines. And within a couple of years, the British Transport Commission, which by now was the sole body responsible for managing the railways, had decided to look at the potential for using diesel multiple units on longer distance services as well. So the original idea to use them for branch line trains was now being expanded, so they were being used for secondary passenger services. And even thinking was starting to go in the direction of using them for longer distance, what we would now call intercity services, which in fact eventually they were. When diesel multiple units were first discussed within British Railways, Robert Riddles was still in charge of mechanical engineering, and so he, nominally anyway, had responsibility for the railcar programme, but he was not a diesel enthusiast, and I think it's fair to say that he tolerated rather than enthusiastically endorsed the plan for DMUs. But anyway, by the time the plans had become reality in 1954, Riddles had gone from the railway, and planning from that point on was done by engineers and traffic operators who were much keener on the concept of using diesels for railway traction. DMU programme was blighted, I think is probably not too strong a word, by the multitude of designs that were constructed. Up to a point this was understandable because this was a fairly new kind of vehicle on the railway. There had been experiments, particularly by the Great Western Railway, with diesel rail cars, but this was a new generation of units, and so it was understandable that there was going to be an element of experimentation and trying out different designs. But when you look at the number of designs that were not only built, but also built in some numbers, it does, with the benefit of hindsight, seem a little strange that there was such a diversity, such a variety. Made it very interesting for the railway enthusiast, perhaps not quite so sensible in terms of operating efficiencies.
The threat which has hung over Britain for months suddenly becomes reality. Drivers and firemen desert their footplates, the fires are drawn, and our economic life suffers a stranglehold which no other group of skilled workers could have imposed. A strange way to convince the public that the loco men's claim is just. At stations and depots, the footplate men mount their pickets, while at the Hampstead headquarters of their union, the executive meets, for the time being a more powerful body than Parliament itself.
In May and June of 1955, ASLEF, which was the trade union representing the locomotive drivers and firemen, went on strike. And they brought British Railways pretty well to a halt, with a lot of damage done to the British economy.
Meanwhile, industry and the public must presumably put up with national chaos and personal inconvenience. At the great London stations, all is still. Other railway grades oppose the strike, but without the drivers they can do little, and would-be travellers can only wait and hope for the very few trains that are running.
So it was an important strike, partly because it was a turning point for the railways. Up until that point, they had enjoyed not quite a monopoly, but they were certainly the backbone of the British transport system. But the road haulage industry, the long-distance road haulage industry, which had been nationalised along with the railways in 1948 and then denationalised in the early 1950s under the Conservative government, that long-distance road haulage industry was now very well organised and in fact proved very competent, very able to take a lot of the traffic which the railways had previously regarded as their own.
London's railway stations tell the story of the strike that began over the Whitsun holiday. Similar scenes could be witnessed throughout the length and breadth of the country. The gravity of the situation was, if anything, emphasized by the rare train that ran.
Yes, we can proudly say Britain carries on. After days of much inconvenience, the road wheels are still turning, and now the police are saying, we think the people are wonderful. The Home Secretary, Major Lloyd George, visited the Scotland Yard control room and then toured London's chief traffic areas. With emergency regulations governing the public services, the letter aircraft of the RAF are lending a hand in the movement of long-distance mail. The Army, too, is helping to overcome the long-range transport difficulties confronting the postal authorities. All this has meant further congestion on the roads, so the leisurely Thames water bus has now become the Workers' Express to Tower Pier and all points east. It's often said that it takes a crisis to bring out the best in British people, and once again the old wartime camaraderie is in evidence. You can't hide behind your newspaper on a lorry. Motorists have responded well to the government's Give a Lift appeal. Patient hitchhikers soon got picked up, at least most of them did. To save time and explanation, some displayed their destination. But motorists are so used to being told to go to unpronounceable places that this one didn't surprise them. Yes, it's that celebrated village in North Wales. So, at the end of a long day, Londoners join those mile-long queues and wait cheerfully for better days.
So when the strike was settled, after a couple of months, the railways found that much of that traffic, which had gone to road during the dispute, didn't return, and the freight industry never really recovered from that blow.
The strike settlement produced great excitement out at the Ministry of Labour. Sir Brian Robertson, Chief of the Transport Commission, gave us this comment.
The only thing that I would like to say this evening is this. Please remember that these men who have been on strike are our men, and we don't want to leave a sense of bitterness among them.
it was an important turning point when the country realised that roads could do a lot more, and perhaps even more importantly than the country realising that the roads could do a lot more, the Treasury, which has always had a very big say in how the railways have run since the Second World War, the Treasury realised that road could play a much bigger part in the country's economy, and so it was approved.
Here's Mr. Beatty, General Secretary of ASLEF.
I'm glad it's come to an end. We look forward to the days of success. So we're hoping by tomorrow to see British Railways, which have always been a proud part, working normally and to the satisfaction and pride of all concerned.
In the post-World War period, although we tend to think of the railways as being a rather strike-prone industry, in fact, when you look at the statistics, it's striking that the number of official disputes, those that were sanctioned by the various trade unions, are really quite small in number. But in the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s, there were quite a large number of unofficial stoppages. And it's very difficult to say, to sort of pin down any one reason for those disputes. I mean, by their very nature, they tended to be localised and they tended to be about very specific grievances. I think the only thing that one can say is that for much of this period, one is talking about an industry which is essentially in decline. It's losing market share. It's finding it harder and harder to get government funding, particularly after the late 1950s. And so it's perhaps not too surprising that as purse strings start to tighten, you get more and more of these local grievances and strikes as managers are trying to save money here, there and everywhere, and working conditions get worse.
Designed and built by English Electric, the Deltic is probably the most famous and certainly the most visually impressive of the first generation diesel prototypes.
When I first saw a Deltic, I must admit I was pretty jolly well impressed. I mean, they were the most remarkable locomotives. The prototype Deltic, of course, had this rather stunning livery. It looked remarkable. It sounded extraordinary. In terms of performance, I mean, it was absolutely unbelievable. I mean, the idea of going from Euston to Watford Junction in a quarter of an hour or 17 minutes or whatever it was, I mean, it was absolutely unheard of. And so to that extent, a grudging admiration for these strange beasts.
British Railways plan to make their service the best in the world, and Transport Commission Chief Sir Brian Robertson opens an exhibition to show how it's to be done.
At this exhibition at Battersea, London, we take a look at some of the first results of the £1,200 million modernisation and re-equipment plan for the railways, like this 3,300 horsepower diesel-electric prototype, most powerful yet built in this country. Locomotives like the Deltic, with its classical lines and tremendous efficiency, it has a maximum service speed of 90 miles an hour, are undoubtedly more than worthy to follow in the great tradition of the giants of steam that have always captured the imagination of boys from 8 to 80.
One outstanding item in the modernisation of British railways is the new Deltic diesel-electric locomotive. It's reported that over 20 of them, the most powerful of their type in the world, are being ordered, and that they'll haul such famous expresses as the Flying Scotsman and the Elizabethan. What a contrast the clean diesel-electric makes compared with the old, smoky, coal-burning locos. The Deltic is capable of well over 100 miles an hour. Not going at that speed here, you say? No, it had to slow down so that we could keep up with it in our helicopter. We shall soon be seeing plenty of Deltics.
Lots of children take their holidays in August, like Prince Charles and Princess Anne, who began theirs at Waterloo Station. In a special coach on a holiday relief train, they left for Southampton to board the Royal Yacht Britannia for a tour of the Western Isles with their parents.
One of the major achievements in railway preservation in the 1950s was the reopening of the narrow-gauge Festiniog Railway in North Wales, financed by Alan Pegler.
Back in 1954, I was alerted to the fact that the Festiniog Railway was on the point of being revived, or people wanted to revive it anyway. Yes, well, the meeting with Lord North Esk way back when was when I was first aware of a preservation movement at all, because North Esk was one of the pioneers of the Tallaght Lynn Railway, and they announced very firmly that in 1951 they were going to get trains running again, and sure enough they did exactly that. But it was very much the meeting with North Esk that inspired me that whatever problems there might be, they were going to be worth overcoming. He really inspired me as a wonderful chap, which he was, and I didn't know anything about the Festiniog Railway at that time, but I looked into it and found out what an historic line it was, and it seemed an awful shame that it had gone into disuse more or less at that time, and that there really was a good chance of being able to do something about it. But as is always the way, I think, any time one tries to get something like that going, at some point money comes into it. And a lot of people thought it was a jolly good idea to revive the old railway if one could. Nobody had got the wherewithal to just put their hands in their pocket and produce a few £1,000s. And luckily for me, there was a small family business, and I had no trouble at all in getting hold of the money to do it. It all took a number of years, I may say. It didn't all happen in a few minutes. But I did manage to get the money and did manage to get control of the railway in 1954. And really, I think that's what started off the idea that I was some sort of an arch preservationist. Not really true at all, but I've rather got the name of being the sort of godfather of railway preservation, I think, which is very, I suppose it's flattering. I'm not quite sure anything with the godfather in I'm slightly dubious about, but nevertheless, there we are. Well, seeing myself on the footplate of the Festiniog all this time later, it does really bring it home. It was, I suppose, pioneering in quite a big way. I don't think I appreciated what a significant move it really was. But it was all a tremendous amount of fun. I do remember all that. It had its serious side, but all totally enjoyable. And it gives me, to this very day, great pleasure in getting up to the railway whenever I can.
Railway closures were not just confined to the beaching era of the 1960s. Little-used branch lines were already beginning to be closed during the 1950s. Opened in 1903, the narrow-gauge Welsh Pool and Llanfair Railway had some initial success in carrying passengers and goods in this rural part of Wales. Making a profit out of the line proved difficult, however, and in 1931 the Welsh Pool and Llanfair, now owned by the GWR following the grouping of 1923, lost its passenger train service due to the competing bus service put on by the GWR. The railway struggled on into the British Railways era as a freight-only branch line. The end came on the 2nd of September 1956, with a Stevenson Locomotive Society Enthusiast Special marking the event, hauled by the Earl, one of the Bayer Peacock tank engines built for the Welsh Pool and Llanfair in 1903. It was the end of an era at Doncaster in October 1957, as the last steam locomotive to be built there left the workshops. The completion of British Railways Standard Class 4, number 76114, drew to a close the long and illustrious history of steam engine design and construction at Doncaster Works, dating back to its opening in 1853 by the Great Northern Railway. Joining the Standard 4 outside the works to mark this historic day was Doncaster's most famous locomotive, Mallard, an LNER A4 class Streamline Pacific. Proudly displaying his long service badge was driver John Best, who had put in over 40 years' service working on the footplate of these steam engines.
May we introduce locomotive number D8200, an 800 horsepower diesel electric for mainline use. It's the first of its type, and it aroused great interest at Euston when it was handed over to the British Transport Commission. It's also a notable occasion for us, the travelling public, because this loco is part of an impressive plan for faster, more punctual trains. We've got an interest in it, of course, because this nationalised industry is spending £1,200 million of our money on streamlining rail services.
The mid-1950s were a really interesting period on British Railways. The need to modernise the railways had long been apparent, but the problem in the late 1940s and the early 1950s was there wasn't that much money to do this, and there was certainly very little by way of materials like steel to carry out widespread rebuilding and modernisation. By the middle 1950s, things were getting better. Materials were there, and the government had decided that it could now make the railway something of a priority for modernisation, so the money was there as well. Railway managers had long been drawing up wish lists of the sorts of projects that they'd like to see undertaken if the money and the materials were there. And when in the mid-1950s the government said, without actually very much notice, OK, the money's there, the materials are there, railway managers very, very quickly put together what was called a modernisation plan. First draft in 1954, published in 1955 as a modernisation plan. It wasn't really a plan. It was more of a wish list of all the sorts of things that managers wanted to see. They wanted to see new forms of traction. They wanted to see widespread electrification. They wanted to see diesel locomotives replacing steam engines. They wanted to see new marshalling yards to improve the efficiency of handling freight services. They wanted to see stations rebuilt. They wanted to see new wagons. They wanted to see new rolling stock. They wanted to look at the modernisation of local passenger services, building more diesel multiple units, and where that wasn't possible, there was even some talk about withdrawing passenger services from lightly used lines. So the modernisation plan was very expensive. It's going to cost hundreds, if not thousands of millions of pounds. Lots of big ideas, not very much by way of hard thinking about what kind of job the railway was likely to do well in the rapidly changing circumstances of the 1950s and the late 1950s, and further still, because the modernisation plan was expected to have a 15-year life. One of the big changes that was proposed under the 1955 modernisation plan was the traction, was the abandonment of steam, the introduction of electric locomotives where that could be justified, and where they couldn't be justified, then the use of diesel locomotives. Problem was, or the challenge facing the engineers was, what type of diesels do we use? Because in Britain there had been no widespread use of diesels up to this point out on the main line. Diesels have been used in shunting yards quite successfully. There have been isolated trials, particularly on the London, Midland and Scottish region and the southern region, with big mainline diesels, but nothing widespread.
Let's look at a depot built specially for the maintenance of mainline diesel locos. A massive glass structure with 6 roads and split-level maintenance, which can handle up to 150 trains like this. Gone are the days when men in the sheds only saw a white shirt at weekends.
There's a certain amount of experience to draw on overseas, but you always had to be careful about looking at what overseas railways were doing, because, to state the obvious, they were different railways, and what would work on one railway wasn't necessarily, in technical, operational or financial terms, a good bet on Britain's railways. So people were feeling their way, they were in the dark. And initially there was quite a sensible plan, which was to try out all sorts of different types of designs of diesel, built by different manufacturers using different components and designed to do different jobs. And to try these out for 3 years and to see which ones worked and which ones didn't. That was a good plan. Unfortunately, after a year or so, the railways found themselves in a real financial crisis, and the British Transport Commission, which had overall responsibility for the railways, ordered that large numbers of diesels be ordered and operated by BR in order to get rid of steam as quickly as possible. It was believed that steam was, the continued use of steam traction was one of the reasons why the railway's finances were deteriorating so rapidly. So large numbers of these untried diesels were ordered. Some, as it turned out, were really quite good. Others were not so good. It's very difficult to generalise, but I'd say that those diesels that have been built by companies that had already gained some experience in building diesel locomotives, such as those from English Electric, did, generally speaking, turn out to be quite reliable machines, and indeed some of those first generation locos are still operating on the railways today, albeit in small numbers. There are other classes of diesels which have disappeared entirely, and disappeared quite quickly within a few years of being introduced. And again, although it's difficult to generalise, it's true that diesel locomotives that were built by companies such as North British, which had had a long and successful tradition of building steam locomotives, often those diesels were not nearly as good as those which were built by companies that had built up some experience in the diesel field. Diesel locomotives and steam locomotives are very different animals. They're very different kinds of machines. They need to be built in different ways, and the sorts of skills and personnel that you have in a company like North British, been building steam locomotives for a long time, cannot straight away develop the skills and the techniques that you need to build a successful diesel, and they didn't. They were unreliable, and that unreliability was made worse, was accentuated by the fact that in the early days diesel locomotives operated often out of the same facilities as steam locomotives. Steam locomotives are very dirty. The environment in which they operate is inevitably rather dirty. Diesel needs to operate in a nice clean environment. So steam and diesel don't mix, basically. And if you've got a locomotive which, in terms of its design and its construction, is, if you like, inherently unreliable, and you stick it in a dirty environment, it's going to make it even more unreliable. It's not a happy mix.
Comparing diesel with steam is always a difficult area because, of course, you're dealing on a simple level with increasingly worn-out machinery that is not being maintained to its peak of perfection versus a new thing. On the face of it, the Deltic might be more powerful, certainly journey times came down, but you were dealing with a brand new machine versus a rather tired one. The other side of that is, of course, the railways were set up to run with steam. So you had a lot of downtime on the part of the diesels because suddenly a load of steam fitters were being asked to maintain a completely different beast. It was a different world and it required a totally different maintenance regime and mindset that only developed. And I think, you know, the last days of the steam locomotive, things were being run in conditions that would not have been tolerated some years before, and things were being given a premature end of life expectancy. So naturally enough, work that should have been done didn't make any economic sense.
In other spheres too, the accent has been on experimentation and thinking to the future. British trains, for example, with their proud history, are today setting new standards in comfort and performance. At this exhibition at Battersea, London, we take a look at some of the first results of the £1,200 million modernisation and re-equipment plan for the railways. Among the prototype passenger vehicles on view, showing what the trains of tomorrow will be like and built to test public reaction under service conditions, is this attractive first-class carriage with the emphasis on comfort. Note the individually adjustable seats. Another carriage of a different design, this time second class, features more legroom by having 6 seats fewer than in those now in service. These carriages are also equipped with a special powder room for the ladies. The kitchen buffet car, already in service and the basis for this type of car built in the future, is designed to operate with adjoining saloons on services where there is a demand for meals and light refreshments, but which do not need the use of a full kitchen car. Apart from that, it looks nice. Another service that has already been tested successfully is the restaurant buffet car, a self-contained unit with a saloon seating 23 passengers and the buffet. Amenities like these will undoubtedly help realize this great plan to make British Railways the best in the world.
British Railways' enormous modernisation scheme goes full steam ahead. Of the estimated £1,200 million to be spent in 15 years, 1/3 has now been committed. Work is on schedule. The aim is to make British Railways the best in the world. Throughout the programme, the technique is modernity itself. Surveying of new routes, extensions, alterations is largely by air. Over big areas, such as the Kent Coast Electrification Scheme, aerial camera survey does the work more efficiently and far more quickly than could be done by ground surveyors. The films, taken so as to overlap slightly, make a complete picture of the area covered. From this picture, Southern Region engineers worked out details of plans necessary for the Kent Coast scheme and then submitted them for expert examination by the Southern Area Board, its chief engineers and top executives. One of the earliest parts of the railway modernisation programme, it was urged forward by Sir Philip Water, the board chairman. Wherever required by Chief Operating Superintendent S.A. Fitch and his team, models were made. Though only part of the 15-year plan, the Kent Coast scheme is a tremendous undertaking. The cost will be 45 millions. 250 route miles will be electrified, and the first phase of the scheme, as far as Ramsgate, Dover and Sheerness, will operate by June 1959. By 1962, all lines in Kent will have been electrified, and the Kent Coast Line will not only carry the heavy and always increasing holiday traffic, it'll also improve residential services for people working in London. Sir Philip Water, chairman, and Mr. C.P. Hopkins, General Manager of Southern Region, inspect progress on the scheme, which is due for completion by June 1959. On the Raynham and Newington section, 100,000 tons of earth have been moved. Newington Station is being rebuilt to allow for 4 tracks instead of 2, and half a dozen other stations are receiving major alterations. The Kent coastline carries continental traffic, suburban traffic, holiday traffic, long-distance commuters, and of course freight. With more tracks, fewer curves, colour light signalling, new rolling stock and electric power all the way, Southern Region will soon be bringing London a lot nearer to the sea.
Margate and other northeast Kent resorts are brought nearer to London by the latest in railway modernisation. The Kent Coast Special made the inaugural run from Victoria. VIPs present included Sir Brian Robertson and Sir Philip Warter. Here, with the General Manager Southern Area, was the Mayor of Ramsgate. He was among the trainload of guests invited to sample the journey by a new train on the newly electrified line of the Southern Region's Southeastern Division. 4 tracks along most of the way. Buffet cars will be as popular with passengers as with the guests on the first trip. 27 bridges have had to be enlarged or rebuilt. Sir Brian Robertson mingled with the travellers. The Director General of French Railways complimented him on the train's comfort. 6 days after this run began the once-an-hour express service, supplemented by several semi-fast trains. To the well-known resorts, it's not only a holiday trade boon, it must also mean that thousands of workers living in London will go down there to live. To the Mayor of Margate, Sir Brian Robertson must seem manna from heaven, and so must the Chairman of the Southern Region, Sir Philip Warter. 2 top railway executives from Belgium came over to inspect the scheme, so the Mayor welcomed good company to Margate. Soon, thousands of jaded city folk will live in the tonic air of the Kent coast. Thousands more will pop down for the day. It's so quick, harassed mothers in London will soon be telling their children after tea, go down to Margate and play on the sands till bedtime.
Well, one of the most important suburban electrification scheme to come out of the 1955 modernisation plan was the wiring of the services out of Liverpool Street and Fenchurch Street in East London. These were very intensively worked steam-operated services which had been considered, in the case of the Liverpool Street, for electrification early in the 20th century. That had come to nothing, and steam had worked on very successfully for several decades, but by the 1950s there was urgent need for modernisation, and the money was found to put the wires up with modern trains, and a very successful scheme all in all. Liverpool Street Station had been built in the 19th century by the Great Eastern Railway, and was a very controversial scheme at the time because it involved the demolition of large amounts of working class areas, working class housing. The railway was obliged by Parliament to provide cheap workmen's trains in and out of Liverpool Street from the suburbs which grew up in the northeast of London, places like Tottenham and Walthamstow. This was an early example of the way in which railways could provide cheap travel for working class people, and was, if you like, an early example of a kind of urban planning, I suppose. Fenchurch Street Station was on what had been the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway, which was something of an interloper into that part of the country, owned originally by the Midland Railway, and had had a reputation for very poor train services for very many decades. So when electrification was proposed and then carried out under the 1955 modernisation plan, it was greeted with great enthusiasm by local commuters who finally got what they considered to be decent trains and a decent railway service. The 1955 modernisation plan had heralded wide-scale electrification on British railways, but electrification itself wasn't anything new. And if we look at Waterloo Station, we can see lots of third rail suburban trains, and that system had been around for the best part of 50 years.
The largest and busiest station in Britain, Waterloo boasts 21 platforms and a concourse 800 feet long. London Waterloo was originally opened in July 1848 by the London and South Western Railway. However, the station we see today dates to the period between 1900 and 1922, during which the station was completely rebuilt. For the Southern Railway, Waterloo provided a grand flagship station, catering to their predominantly middle and upper class clientele commuting to London from the stockbroker belt in Surrey, travelling to Southampton on the boat trains to connect with transatlantic liners, or taking the train to smart social events such as Ascot Week. While steam played a big role on the railways in the southeast, the area is equally renowned for the widespread use of low-voltage third-rail electric trains. This has its roots in the system used by the London and South Western Railway for its Waterloo and City Underground line, which opened in 1898. Many of the Southern Railway's electric multiple units, which were built in the 1920s and 30s, were still in use by British Railways in the mid-1950s. These southern designs were based around existing steam-hauled coaching stock. The Southern's final design of EMUs were the all-steel 4 subunits, specifically designed by Oliver Bullitt for crush-loading suburban commuter services. In 1912, the LSWR drew up plans to electrify the branches from Waterloo to Hampton Court and Shepperton. This was completed in 1916. Around this time, other railway companies in the southeast were also electrifying routes, but using different systems. Following the 1923 grouping into the Southern Railway, the LSWR's 660-volt DC system became the standard used for all their third rail routes. By the 1930s, electrification had expanded beyond the London suburban area to the Southern's main line routes such as Portsmouth, Hastings and Brighton.
The situation which the Tories had created in 1953 didn't last very long, about another 3 or 4 years before it was realised that the British Transport Commission wasn't doing a particularly good job overseeing the management of the railways. And in 1957 the Commission underwent another change and the 6 regions, which were the geographical units that British Railways operated under, the regions were given a good deal more power and authority to run things their own way. So by the early 1960s, the British Transport Commission was a rather different animal from the organisation that had been set up in 1948.
Still steam-hauled by magnificent engines are most of the crack trains of the Western region. It's no use washing whiter if the Cornish Riviera passes the clothesline. The famous King-class locomotives pull another Western region flyer, the Bristolian. Fastest train in Britain, the Bristolian at times exceeds 100 miles an hour. Its average for the run, 67 miles an hour. It's sad to think that superb locomotives of the King and Coronation class must be superseded. Drivers who know their ways and moods as if the engines lived are loath to bid them goodbye. But soon many will drive diesel.
In 1955, I'd gone into the car link at Southall, and then we heard that the rail cars, the diesel rail cars we knew were coming into the jobs, and they were going to take over the car link. So there was 8 of us, 8 firemen. There was 12 in the link, but 8 of us decided that, you know, rather than get made redundant or put back onto the goods again, and I'd spoken to my father and said about going to Old Oak Common on the main line. He said, well, he said, you'll earn some money up there, which we did. And there was 8 of us. March 1955, I transferred to Old Oak Common, and I was up there till 62. But I progressed through all the types of work and mainline work on these jobs, you know. And I had good mates, I had all good drivers. And we had some rough drivers, but I had good drivers. Give you an instance of a job we used to do, like the 1030 Pad to Plymouth. Now that job used to entail leaving Paddingham with a King and 10 or 12 8s on carriages. We called them 8s. Coaches were 8s to us because they had 8 wheels, 2 bogies with 4 wheels on. And we used to then, you'd be non-stop to Plymouth in 4 hours. So getting your engine ready, you've got your own engine ready for the job. I mean, as we were saying, we put a ton of coal in the firebox, building a big middle fire, which you kept a big middle fire, and you would trim your tender, and then you would go out to coal state and you would top him up. You could finish up on the big tender, the 4,000 gallon tender, 9, nearly 10 ton of coal you could stack on him. You could get it on, and it would be quite stacked, you know, it'd be right up high level, and you then as the fireman, you're using it. Now, by the time you're going through Westbury, which is about 96 mile, all that you had stacked at the front has gone. So now you've got the tender doors open, you're having to get in and get it, you're pulling it down. And as you're getting it, you're using it because your mate is still going, you're tearing along, he's still working, the engine's working hard, and you're busy. So once you've got down what you used it, you're back in again. So you're then in pulling coal down, using it, in there again, getting it down, using it. The farther away from home you're going, the farther your coal's going. Water you replenished on the run over water troughs. Every 40 to 50 mile, the farmer will whip over and drop his scoop down as he hit the troughs, get the water he wants, and then back on his job again. So by the time you arrive at Plymouth, your tender's nearly empty. You've cleaned out. So you as a young fireman in 4 hours has shifted 8.5 ton of coal, maybe 9 ton, all depends what the engine, the coal was like and what the driver was like. So you shifted that amount of coal as a young fireman in that 4 hours. You book off, take your engine to shed, you get serviced, you lodge, then the next day you're back on. Now you get the same coming back home.
Here's what she did with primitive power, City of Truro 440, over 100 miles an hour, over 50 years ago. Yes, a wonderful old loco, the first vehicle in the world to do over 100. Now this museum piece has been brought out to haul specials for fans.
Most of the diesels that were ordered under the 1955 modernisation plan were diesel electrics. Diesel engine, electric transmission. But there was a small but important batch of locomotives which were diesel hydraulics. In other words, diesel engine, but the transmission system was a hydraulic, fluid-based system.
A demonstration run from London to Bristol. He's at the controls of British Railway's new 2,000 horsepower diesel hydraulic loco. A special coach next to the engine was used on this trip to demonstrate and record speed and performance. The plan is the replacement of steam by diesel traction on the western region, giving greater economy, cleanliness and speed.
At Paddington, the first diesel hydraulic locomotive built in British Railway's own workshops was named after the chairman of British Transport Commission. The general manager of the Western Region, Mr. K.W.C. Grand, was in charge of the ceremony. Sir Brian Robertson, as head of British Railways, is at the helm of the vast modernisation programme. Nothing on comparable scale has been attempted ever in Great Britain before.
It seemed possible, largely based on the experience of the West German railways, that diesel hydraulic locomotives could provide lighter machines for a given power output than the diesel electric designs of the time, and that they might even be cheaper to operate, to maintain. And I think it was worth giving the diesel hydraulic a try. The Western region was very keen on using diesel hydraulics, and the British Transport Commission was willing to allow a small number of these locomotives to be tried out on that region. That's what happened. But it fairly soon became apparent that the German designs didn't translate too well to British conditions, and in particular they were rather expensive to maintain. And so by the mid-1960s the decision was made to abandon diesel hydraulic locomotives on British railways, and the last hydraulics disappeared in the mid-1970s, which was not a very long lifetime for what was really quite an expensive bit of kit.
Of the two major classes of diesel hydraulic locomotives introduced by the Western region, the D800 warships' curved body shell bore a strong resemblance to the German V200 machines upon which the warships were based. A major problem in adapting the V200 design for use on Britain's railways was that the more capacious German loading gauge allowed their locomotives to be 10 inches higher and 16 inches wider than in the UK, with the result that the same engines and hydraulic transmissions were crammed into a much smaller space on the warships. Several batches of warships were built, some at Swindon fitted with Maybach engines, and some at North British using MAN engines. In service, the Maybach engined machines proved to be more powerful and more reliable than those fitted with the MAN engines. The frequent problems with the North British built warships led to them being relegated from passenger to freight train duties. The Maybach-powered machines did have their period of glory, though. They were regularly used double-headed on the Western region's prestigious long-distance passenger trains. The D1000 Westerns again took as their basis German Maybach machines with hydraulic transmissions, but unlike the warships, the Western region designed the locomotives themselves from the ground up. An order for 74 locomotives was placed by the BTC in September 1959. Construction was split between Swindon and Crewe, with the first member of the class, D1000 Western Enterprise, being outshopped in December 1961. After ironing out a series of mechanical problems in the early years, most of which were blamed on Bristol Siddeley, who produced the Maybach engines under licence, the Westerns proved to be formidable performers on the West of England mainline services in the late 1960s. The National Traction Plan, published in 1967, saw no future for the diesel hydraulics. It called for some kind of order to be returned to the locomotive fleet after the chaotic years of the BTC ordering a myriad of different types and designs. Those classes which were of small numbers or were expensive to maintain would have to be withdrawn. Fortunately for the Westerns, they couldn't be withdrawn as quickly as BR would have liked due to the unavailability of the English Electric Class 50s, which had been expected to replace the hydraulics on the Western region. So the Westerns soldiered on into the early 1970s, often not in the best mechanical condition, as depot maintenance staff had been instructed to keep them running without any major overhauls. Designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel and Matthew Digby Wyatt, Paddington Station, the London terminus of the Great Western Railway, was opened in January 1854, replacing the original, more modest station dating from 1838. As designed by Brunel and Wyatt, Paddington consisted of 3 barrel-vaulted roof spans made of wrought iron, which covered an area of 700 feet by 238 feet. As traffic increased during the early years of the 20th century, an additional steel and glass roof span with additional platforms was completed in 1916. An adjoining station at Bishopsbridge Road provided platforms for the Metropolitan Railway's trains, while in 1913 the Bakerloo Railway's underground station was opened at Paddington. As passenger numbers increased and trains became longer and more frequent, major work was undertaken during the 1930s to extend the platforms and the concourse. Paddington runs a busy timetable of local and commuter services to West London and the Thames Valley area, but is probably best known for its long-distance trains to Birmingham, Bristol, South Wales and the West Country. The GWR, and later the Western region, ran a formidable list of named trains from Paddington Station. Amongst them, famous trains like the Cambrian Coast Express, the Bristolian, the Cathedrals Express, the Red Dragon, and surely the most famous of them all, the Cornish Riviera Express. Throughout the 1960s and on into the 1970s, the diesel hydraulics, particularly the Westerns, became a familiar sight at Paddington Station. The Class 52s, as the Westerns became known, did indeed become very popular with railway enthusiasts, and many were sorry to see them go.
Scorfield Pike, driven from a comfortable cabin that gives little hint of its 2,300 horsepower, was on view at Marylebone Station. It's the most powerful mainline diesel-electric loco to be erected in British Railways' own workshops. 147 more will be running by 1961. Maximum speed will be 90 miles an hour. It's another nail in the coffin of the fine old steam locomotives, whose fatal fault is that they burn too much coal. So oil takes over, as elsewhere on the British system, lines are being electrified. Railway modernization makes fine headway.
One of the more successful locomotive designs to come out of the 1955 modernisation plan was the Salzer Type 4 diesel electric. They were all named after British mountains, which led to them gaining the nickname Peaks. The first of these Type 4s was built at Derby Works in 1959 and numbered D1. These utilised a 12-cylinder Salzer diesel engine delivering 2,500 horsepower. With the combined weight of the large diesel engine and generator, all the ancillary electrical equipment, plus the addition of a diesel-fuelled steam heating boiler, the Type 4s turned out to be a heavyweight design. To spread the weight on the tracks, the engineers had to resort to large steel plate bogies with 4 axles, 3 of which were driven. For many years, the Peaks were synonymous with the Midland Main Line services operating out of London St Pancras Station. St Pancras was originally opened in 1868 and was the London terminus for Midland Railway services from the East Midlands and West Yorkshire. The station's single-span roof of 243 feet was the largest built up to that time. The structure was a collaboration between the station's designer, William Henry Barlow, and engineer Roland Mason Ordish. Historically, St Pancras did not fare as well as the other London termini. The grouping of the railway companies in the 1920s merged the Midland Railway with the London and North Western Railway. The new company, the LMS, chose to use the LNWR's Euston station as its principal London terminus. Services still continued to run to North London and Bedford, and there were some long-distance services to Northern England and Glasgow. But by the 1960s, with the modernisation of Euston and the electrification of the West Coast Main Line, attempts were made to close St Pancras and demolish it. Luckily, this provoked a huge swell of opposition to the closure plans, greatly aided by a campaign led by Sir John Betjeman. Another successful design to come from the orders placed as part of the 1955 modernisation plan were the English Electric Type 3s, later to become BR Class 37s. Construction of the locomotives was split between English Electric's Vulcan Foundry Works at Newton-le-Willows and their Robert Stephenson and Hawthorne Works in Darlington. Powered by English Electric's 12-cylinder 1,750 horsepower diesel engine, they were suited for both freight and passenger work, and with a relatively low axle loading for their size and power could work on many lines across the national network. 309 Class 37s were built between 1960 and 1965. The locos were visibly similar to the earlier Class 40s, also built by English Electric. The Class 37s had long working lives with British Railways, and many survived into the privatisation era of the 1990s and beyond.
Few of us know anything at all about freight services, a less romantic perhaps, but vitally important aspect of modernisation. The plan provides for the concentration of marshalling into fewer highly mechanized centres. In fact, we already have places like Temple Mills here, most modern marshalling yard in Europe, with novel features like what appear to be robot trucks operating themselves. The method is worked by the automatic operation of primary retarders, which ensure that wagons descend from the hump at the optimum speed for safe shunting. Weight and approach speed are first measured by mechanical and electronic equipment, which passes on the information to the retarder mechanism by the time the wagon reaches it. Secondary retarders are operated from the control tower.
Another aspect of the 1955 plan was the development of very large mechanised marshalling yards. And these were designed to improve the handling of wagon load freight trains of the day. And wagon load freight, basically lorry-size consignments of goods, general merchandise and so on. The railways had carried this kind of traffic for over a century. It was seen by managers at the time as being a very, very important part of the railway's business. But in fact, just as the plan was being proposed and was being funded by government, that kind of traffic was coming under increasing pressure from road haulage, from lorries, and was quite rapidly disappearing from the railways. In fact, within 15 years, it had almost entirely disappeared, and there's next to none of that left today. So one could argue that the marshalling yards were the big white elephant of the 1955 plan. It cost a lot of money, but many of them, most of them indeed, never operated at anything like their designed capacity. Could the railways have done more to keep freight on the rails? Perhaps, but they would only have done so by drastically reducing their charges for carrying certain types of goods, And I think the reality is that that would have made the traffic, well, I was going to say unprofitable. I suspect a lot of the traffic was unprofitable anyway, but it would have made it even less profitable than it was in the trading conditions of the mid and late 1950s. And one of the big problems was the railways simply didn't know how much it cost them to move, a ton of apples, for example, from station A to station B. It was guesswork, and so the charges which they levied for a particular haul often didn't relate to the cost of actually providing the service. And that was very, very different from the way road hauliers operated. They knew what it cost them to carry a particular load, and they charged on the basis of they had to cover their costs and make a profit. And if they couldn't make a profit on a particular haul, they wouldn't carry the traffic. The railways didn't operate like that. In fact, the railways at this time didn't have the freedom to say no. They were still common carriers. They had to carry anything that was offered them. So they could have kept more freight on the rails, but the losses would almost certainly have been even worse than they were proving to be.
With the new marshalling yards handling many times the amount of freight they have in the past, new goods sheds with every labour-saving contraption, like this one at Peterborough, are being built.
Goods traffic had long been a mainstay of British railways, but after the Second World War, lorries were taking more and more of that traffic away, and the railways had to find a way of cutting their costs. One of the problems they faced was the high labour costs of traditional way of moving goods out of vans and into lorries and so on. And so part of the modernisation plan was to mechanise as much as possible and to adopt new forms of handling goods like pallets. And so there's a lot of modernisation money went into trying to mechanise goods sheds.
Electronics, too, play a part in new methods of goods handling. The Robotug finds its own way round a depot, following a single wire below ground. Look, no hands.
The modernisation of British Railways' parcels and goods handling facilities saw them building larger modern centres, which were strategically sited and well equipped with up-to-date mechanical handling equipment. These were intended to be much more economical to operate, replacing a multitude of small depots and yards. With the railways offering goods deliveries across the entire country, the Scammell Scarab mechanical horse, introduced in the late 1940s, formed the backbone of BR's town parcels delivery service. Produced in the tens of thousands up until 1967, the Scarab was a simple and sturdy three-wheeled vehicle with an automatic coupling which allowed trailers to be picked up and dropped off quickly and easily without the driver even needing to get out of the cab. A unique feature of the mechanical horses was that its single front wheel could turn 360 degrees, making it highly manoeuvrable. 3-ton and 6-ton models were built, both powered by Scammell's 2-litre petrol engine. Perkins diesel engine versions were later introduced. Production of the Scarab ended in 1967 and was replaced with the Scammell Townsman, which now featured a fiberglass cab. The Townsman utilised many developments in large road vehicles at the time, including vacuum-assisted hydraulic brakes. The same automatic coupling was used, however a vacuum-operated release mechanism replaced the hand lever used on the Scarab. Production of the Townsman ended in 1968.
Here's a novel idea which cuts out the bother of getting the freight onto the train in the first place. The 11-ton road railer has an ingenious rear undercarriage that turns it in 90 seconds from a lorry to a wagon, with flanged steel rims replacing rubber tires. Consequently, as a means of freight delivery, it has the flexibility of a lorry that can drive from door to door, avoiding the usual problems of traffic congestion.
The railways have been carrying the Royal Mail since the 19th century, and in a way the 1960s were a golden age for the railways because the motorway network hadn't been built and there was very little mail going by air at that time. So the railways were still carrying the vast majority of the Royal Mail. Even so, there were opportunities to cut costs, and mechanisation was increasing in the 1960s.
Throughout the 19th century, there was a huge growth in the use of travelling post offices. The trains, however, were suspended during both the First and Second World Wars, and by the time TPOs began running again in 1945, only 43 services remained, the cutbacks being caused by the reduced number of deliveries in post-war Britain. The use of the line-side exchange apparatus by travelling post offices dates back to the early days of the service and remained in use up until 1971. The system allowed the trains to pick up and put down mail whilst on the move. As one bag was collected into the net on board the TPO, another was released from the train and dropped onto the ground. There were two basic sorts of vehicles used on a TPO: sorting vans and stowage vans. It was not until 1959 the British Railways started building a new fleet of TPO rolling stock to replace the pre-nationalisation vehicles still in use at that time. "145 new carriages were built over a period of 18 years. The last of the pre-nationalisation vehicles were withdrawn by 1978. Further cutbacks to the travelling post office network were to come in 1968, when the Post Office introduced the two-tier postal system, by which customers were charged a higher rate for first-class items. This affected the TPOs, as it was decided they would handle only the first-class mail, and it soon became apparent that there was insufficient overnight business to sustain some of the services which started to be withdrawn in 1972. Still popular in the 1950s were the various boat train services that connected London with the continental ports. Seen here at London Liverpool Street Station is the Hook Continental, which ran over the former LNER line to Harwich, where the train connected with the ferry service to the Hook of Holland. The Southern had many famous named trains, one of which, the Night Ferry, was the only through train from London to Paris. In 1957, a through sleeping car to Brussels was added to the train. Hauled here by one of the Southern region's E5000 electric locomotives, the train consisted of vans for luggage and sleeping cars provided by the Wagon-Lee Company. At Dover, the sleeping cars and vans were shunted onto one of 3 train ferries, which had been specially constructed by the Southern Railway. The E5000 locos were built as part of the 1955 modernisation plan for use on mainline passenger and freight trains on the newly electrified Kent Coast system. Reintroduced in 1946 after the Second World War, the Golden Arrow Pullman service ran from London Victoria to Dover for a ferry connection to Calais. Once across the English Channel, a corresponding French Pullman train, the Flèche d'Or, transported passengers onwards to Paris. As the 60s went on, the increase in car ownership, coupled with the introduction of new car ferries and hovercraft across the Channel, along with the expansion of air services between London and Paris, led to the Golden Arrow's decline, and the final train ran on the 30th of September 1972. The southern region's most glamorous trains were the ocean liner expresses, which were operated to carry passengers to and from the ocean liners that docked at Southampton. The trains, carrying the rich and famous, politicians and movie stars, ran to Southampton's Ocean Terminal Station. Perhaps the most prestigious of those trains was the Cunarder. This was a Pullman service that connected with the Cunard Line's transatlantic service to New York, operated by two of the most legendary ocean liners ever built, RMS Queen Mary and RMS Queen Elizabeth. Filmed in 1959 at Southampton Ocean Terminal, the Queen Elizabeth set sail for New York. By the early 1960s, the enormous growth in transatlantic air travel had led to a steady decline in the numbers of people travelling by sea.
Now, in case you've never met one, let me introduce the new diesel-electric Pullman train, evidence of British Railways' progress in their streamlining and modernisation programme. It's a luxury express with improved comfort. Smooth, almost silent travel, I'm told, and fully air-conditioned coaches. Double windows with adjustable Venetian blinds between the panes of glass. The armchair seats are adjustable too, and I've no doubt that those who sit in them will find that menus have also been modernised. It would be disappointing to find the old brown Windsor aboard a train like this.
The trains are one more item in the modernisation programme of British Railways. They're so comfortable, they'll have to have somebody going round to say, "Wake up, sir, you're here."
In the 1950s, long-distance European express trains had been modernised, something called the Trans-Europe Express TEE system, using high-speed, often diesel multiple-unit trains. And in the early 1960s, British Railways latched onto this idea as a way of creating a new image for what was to become intercity transport, a way of competing, particularly in the business market, with the rapidly intensifying threat of road competition on the new and expanding motorway network. And the Blue Pullmans were one outcome of this new way of thinking. They were advanced trains for the days. They were high-speed, multiple-unit trains, diesel engine. Pullmans meant that they were luxuriously equipped inside, very comfortable, at-seat dining, so a very, very high level of passenger service, customer service, I suppose we'd say now. These trains were used on the Western region, down to Bristol and South Wales, and on the London Midland region, principally on the route out of St Pancras up to Manchester. That was an interesting choice of route because this was the time that the West Coast main line was being electrified, so there was a lot of disruption on that route. And putting these new trains on the alternative route to Manchester via the Midland Railway was quite a smart move in terms of retaining the business traffic. They were popular trains, at least initially, but there were problems with them. I think the main problem from the passengers' point of view was that they were high speed, but they weren't particularly comfortable at high speed because they were rough riding. They had a Swiss design of bogie underneath the coaches, which didn't perform very well under British conditions on British railway track. So the cups of coffee got rather shaken about and spilt and so on inside the Pullman cars, and passengers got a bit fed up with them quite quickly. And they disappeared within 10 years or so. The Blue Pullmans are interesting because in terms of their basic concept, a high-speed diesel train with high-powered locomotive or power car at each end, there is striking resemblance to the high-speed train of the 1970s train, which is still very much with us today and which is at the core of the long-distance intercity business. There were important differences though. The Blue Pullmans were very rough riding, largely because of the design of a bogie. That bogie had been designed abroad and was not tweaked, was not intended for running on British railway track. But the main problem with that bogie design was that the fundamental scientific understanding of the way that the rail and the wheel interacted wasn't sufficiently advanced to design any kind of bogie that would run smoothly at 100 miles per hour plus. By the time the high-speed train comes in the mid-1970s, the science has developed to the point where the engineers know how to design a much better bogie. So the high-speed train has a radically different kind of bogie design and is a very, very comfortable train.
Just 5 Blue Pullman sets were built in total. The Western region received 3 8-car sets in 1966, which, unlike the 2 6-car sets delivered to the London Midland region, contain both first and second class seats.
The Blue Pullman was a brave attempt by the Western region to break into the business market to Birmingham from Paddington. And it was a break from tradition because the Great Western Railway, the predecessor to the Western region, had traditionally had nothing to do with Pullman services, preferring to provide its own luxury trains instead of using those provided by the then separate Pullman company.
The Midland Pullmans ran between St Pancras and Manchester until 1967, when the completion of electrification work on the line from Euston provided faster trains than the Blue Pullmans, so they were withdrawn from traffic and transferred to the Western region. The Western initially ran 2 services from Paddington with the Blue Pullmans, one to Bath and Bristol and the other to Birmingham and Wolverhampton. The Pullman supplements on the trains were 10 shillings first class and 5 shillings second class. The Blue Pullmans ran on Mondays to Fridays only, leaving them free at weekends for maintenance to be carried out, although a spare set of loco-hold Pullman carriages was kept at Old Oak Common to cover in case of breakdowns during the week. From the summer of 1961, an additional service was added to Cardiff and Swansea, the South Wales Pullman. The service to Birmingham and Wolverhampton came to an end in March 1967. The 5 Blue Pullman sets continued working the services to Bristol and South Wales until May 1973. After withdrawal, nothing was preserved of the unique Blue Pullmans. All the vehicles were subsequently scrapped by British Railways.
It's very easy in the excitement of looking at new forms of traction and rolling stock to forget that the modernisation plan also meant that a lot of money was spent on the infrastructure. I'm thinking particularly here of signalling.
The familiar wooden signal boxes are disappearing too, being replaced by centralised ultra-modern boxes like this, which are so complex that the Signals and Telecommunications Department of today is probably the most highly specialised in the whole of the railway system.
Signalling, of course, is very, very important for the safety of the railway. And in the mid-1950s, a lot of that signalling dated back to the late 19th century or the Edwardian period. The Big Four railways had experimented in their different ways with new kinds of signalling, in particular colour light signals, where the traditional mechanical semaphore signals are replaced with different kinds of colour lights. But the 1955 plan brought forward a lot of projects to extend the new colour light signalling and also to extend other kinds of safety systems like the automatic warning signal device, which would give the driver of a train a warning of a signal ahead which had an adverse aspect. And I think that these new systems together did help make the railway an even safer form of transport. Although The old mechanical ways of doing things were very safe and are still to be found on the railway today. And I have no qualms at all about travelling on a train that's in a mechanically signalled area. It's far safer than going by car. What the new signalling systems, colour light and so on did allow, though, was a very big reduction in the number of staff who were employed as signalmen, the term then was, because the new systems didn't need nearly as many signal boxes. So instead of a signal box every 2, 3, 4 miles or so, you would have much bigger signal boxes, perhaps 30, 40 miles apart, controlling much wider areas.
There's nothing like working on the railway for keeping you fit, according to 53-year-old Miss Dolly Palmer. Dolly's been at Althorne Station in Essex for 20 years, and she takes everything to do with the station in her stride, whether it's cleaning the signal glasses way up aloft, or climbing down again because someone wants to use the level crossing. What's the station master up to, letting a woman do all the work? Well, the answer's simple. Dolly is the station master, and the signalman, and the porter, the lot. Althorne Station is open 18 hours a day, and Dolly and a male colleague run it in alternate shifts, each of them quite single-handed. And this isn't just a sleepy 2 trains a day halt. 32 trains stop here every weekday and 15 every Sunday. What does Dolly do with her free time? Walks 3 miles to work and 3 miles home again.
Another major problem which the 1955 modernisation plan tried to tackle was the very, very rundown, ageing stations and other passenger facilities which British Railways had inherited from the Big Four companies.
Needless to say, one of the greatest problems is to build new stations and keep the present ones operating. A solution to this engineer's nightmare would be to shut down stations like Euston for a couple of years, but that's not exactly practical. Some of the new designs are extremely attractive. This, for example, is Oxford Road, Manchester. However, before projects like these can be started, scale models have to be made of each proposed new station and considered by an endless number of bodies such as ministries, municipal councils, police, chambers of commerce, and remote concerns we've probably never even heard of. This, by the way, is a glimpse of Leeds City Station as it will eventually look. We grumble sometimes at higher fares, and why not? But it's good to know that by these means, our railways will not only make up lost ground, but be able to continue their old tradition of pioneering and set new standards for the world to follow.
The late 1950s and particularly the 1960s saw some big rebuilding schemes. Birmingham New Street, for example, Euston, 2 that come to mind. Those 2 as part of the modernisation, the electrification of the West Coast Main Line, but also many more much smaller schemes where old Victorian buildings were swept aside to be replaced by often much more modest facilities, more in keeping with the reduced level of business that wayside stations were doing in this period. I think the results from the passengers' point of view were somewhat mixed. There's no denying that often the old buildings were run down, they were cold, drafty, inappropriate for modern conditions. On the other hand, the new buildings were built to a price, and within a few years some of them were showing some of the design faults and were perhaps not as well regarded as by passengers anyway as the managers would have liked them to have been. It is noticeable that some of the station rebuilds of the 1960s have been rebuilt yet again within the last 10, 15 years. Poole Station in Dorset is one example. Partly for very good reason that traffic levels have increased again, and so the sort of cut-down facilities in the 1960s are simply not adequate for increasing levels of passengers, and also passengers' much higher expectations of what the railway should deliver in terms of comfort and security and so on.
The age of steam is almost dead, and suddenly it seems not only are the trains and stations different, but perhaps more important, what goes on behind the scenes, such as the new method of buying a ticket from machines which print everything on the spot, recording details of the sale at the same time.
The AEG multi-printer ticket machines were introduced into station booking offices in the 1960s and remained in use on British Railways until the mid-1980s. They enabled the printing of traditional cardboard Edmondson-style tickets at the time of purchase by the passenger, thus doing away with the need to keep vast stocks of pre-printed tickets for any destination on the network, as had been the case up until then.
Outside of London, Glasgow had one of the biggest suburban commuter networks in the country, but those trains were steam operated, and by the 1950s they were in dire need of modernisation. And in the early 1960s, electric trains were introduced in the Glasgow region, first on the south side of the city, with some very stylish new trains, became known as the Blue Trains. They were painted in a very attractive light blue livery. They'd been passed out by the new British Rail industrial design panel and were aesthetically very, very, very attractive trains. Very, very successful from a technical point of view, even more successful from a commercial point of view. Glaswegians flocked to the trains, and the Blue Trains became a very, very popular form of transport.
The British Railways Modernisation Plan of 1955 called for the electrification of the Glasgow suburban railway system. The AM3 electric multiple units, later classified as BR Class 303s, were introduced in 1960 for use on the newly electrified North Clyde and Cathcart Circle lines in Strathclyde. Each of the 3 car sets had a seating capacity of 236. Top speed was 75 miles per hour. The driving cabs had distinctive wraparound front windows, while glass partitions behind the cabs allowed passengers in the front and rearmost carriages to see the driver's view of the track. "91 of the 3-car Blue Train units were built by Press Steel at Linwood near Paisley. Up to 4 sets could be operated in multiple to form up to a 12-car formation. The units had many features which made them state-of-the-art at the time of their introduction, such as the use of pneumatically operated sliding doors with passenger-operated door opening buttons. The 2 outer carriages of each unit were driving trailers, with an intermediate motor coach containing the motor bogies and electrical equipment. They used the standard 25 kilovolt AC overhead power line system, with power collection via a pantograph on the motor coach. The Blue Trains put in many years of valuable service for British Railways. Following a refurbishment programme started in 1984, some of them ran on into the 1990s.
Alarmingly on the increase on British railways is willful damage to trains. At a first aid depot at Wimbledon Park, experts quickly note what repairs are necessary. If vandalism goes on at this rate, it will cost British Railways £500,000 before the end of the year. It doesn't only happen in London. Most big cities have the same trouble. The first aid depots keep hard at it to get the trains back into service. But at weekends, the vandals really enjoy themselves, wrecking all they can. Tables, cushions, windows, armrests, anything goes. It's incredible. Removing mirrors is very popular. The taxpayer foots the bill, so it's in everybody's interest to report any vandal they see. The senseless craze must be stopped.